Everyone knows Night City got nuked. It's literally half of what you experience playing as Johnny in the game. The bombing of Arasaka Tower is one of those events that's become part of the background of the world. You accept that it happened, accept the consequences, and move on with the story. But at some point while I was playing, watching the explosion going off in the distance, I started wondering what the actual numbers behind this explosion looked like. As Night City is extremely dense, I was curious about how many people actually died. How much damage did the bomb actually do? So I went digging, and to be honest, I expected there to be a straightforward answer. But instead, the very first thing the Night City Holocaust database tells you is the only undisputable fact is the date. Everything else, from the number of casualties to those responsible for the attack, is described as pure speculation, gossip, lies, and conspiracy theories. And when I read that, I started wondering, if the game's own official history is telling us not to trust the accepted version of events, what else doesn't hold up? What else is wrong? However, trying to reconstruct exactly what happened from conflicting historical accounts wasn't going to get me very far. The Cyberpunk universe is built around misinformation, corporate cover-ups, and competing narratives. If the lore itself admits the history has been shaped by propaganda, then arguing over which version is correct becomes almost impossible. But despite all those competing accounts, one version of events became the official historical record, which is presented in Cyberpunk Red, the official sourcebook that defines the history of Night City. So instead of trying to decide who was telling the truth, I decided to test that official account against real-world physics. Now, some parts of the story simply can't be verified. We don't know exactly how many people were standing in Corpo Plaza that morning. We don't have detailed engineering drawings of the original Arasaka Towers. But the bomb itself still had to obey the laws of physics, which means some of the biggest claims in the official account can actually be tested. Questions like, was everyone around Corpo Plaza really incinerated? Could an explosion that size have triggered the earthquake and liquefaction the lore describes? And do the stated effects of the blast actually match the weapon that was used? To answer those questions, we first need to establish one simple fact. Was the Night City Holocaust actually an airburst? Because that single detail determines almost every calculation that follows. A nuclear weapon detonated underground, at ground level, or hundreds of meters in the air behaves very differently. Before we can evaluate the claims about incineration, blast damage, or earthquakes, we first need to know where the bomb exploded. For an explosion to qualify as an airburst, two conditions have to be met. First, it must detonate below 100,000 feet. And secondly, and most importantly, the fireball itself must never touch the ground. We know the bomb detonated on the 120th floor of the southern Arasaka Tower, roughly 10 floors below the roof. That places the detonation at approximately 366 meters above sea level, comfortably below the 100,000 foot threshold. While we can't measure that directly in-game because the original Arasaka Tower no longer exists, virtually every source agrees on both the tower's approximate height and the bomb's location within it. So the first requirement is satisfied. But what about the second? According to the empirical fireball relationships published in The Effects of Nuclear Weapons by Glasstone and Dolan, which will serve as the primary reference for the physics discussed here, a device between 0.1 and 0.5 kilotons would produce a maximum fireball radius of approximately 29 to 46 meters. The detonation occurred at an elevation of roughly 366 meters above sea level. Since Corpo Plaza sits only around 15 to 20 meters above sea level, even at the upper estimate, the fireball would still have stopped more than 300 meters above the ground. In other words, it never came remotely close to reaching street level. So the official account got this one right. This is definitively an airburst. But here's what that also tells us. If the fireball never reached the ground, then anything attributed to direct contact with the fireball immediately becomes questionable. And that's where the next claim gets complicated. According to the official account, the blast instantly incinerated 12,000 people in the vicinity of the towers. The tower split in half and collapsed outward, and the entire corporate center was reduced to ruins within seconds. That's a lot happening in a short space of time. From a bomb we just established was a relatively small tactical device. So let's actually look at what the explosion could and couldn't have done at ground level, starting with the incineration claim. The word incinerated here is important because it implies something very specific. It suggests people were consumed by extreme temperatures of the nuclear fireball itself. But that's not what the physics tells us. As we just calculated, the fireball never reached the streets below, but that doesn't mean the streets escaped the explosion. They didn't. The thermal pulse would have reached the ground almost instantly, delivering an intense burst of radiant heat capable of causing severe burns and igniting exposed materials. Moments later, the blast wave would have arrived, tearing through buildings with immense overpressure and hurricane-force winds. But neither of those effects have the capability of instantly incinerating thousands of people. And critically, this wasn't an unobstructed airburst. Hundreds of thousands of tons of reinforced concrete, structural steel, and internal floors surrounded the weapon at the moment it exploded. Those materials would have absorbed, reflected, and blocked a significant portion of the thermal radiation before it ever escaped the tower. Whatever thermal pulse reached the streets would therefore have been substantially less intense than an equivalent free air detonation. However, that doesn't mean nobody died from thermal effects. They absolutely would have. People close to the tower would have suffered horrific burns, clothing and vehicles would have been ignited, and fires would have spread rapidly throughout the district. But the physics suggests the thermal pulse alone is unlikely to explain 12,000 people being instantly incinerated, which means many of those immediate deaths probably didn't come from direct exposure to the fireball or thermal pulse. They most likely came from the blast wave and the almost immediate catastrophic chain of events it triggered. Buildings failed, debris filled the streets, and above all, the Arasaka towers themselves began to collapse. The official account states that the tower split in half and collapsed outward, and structurally, that's one of the more believable parts of the story. The original Arasaka towers were 130-floor megatowers. To put that scale into perspective, the original World Trade Center towers were roughly 110 floors and contained around 1 million tons of structural material combined, which means the Arasaka towers of 2023 would therefore likely have contained hundreds of thousands to over 1 million tons of structural mass each. And given where the bomb detonated, only 10 floors from the roof, the upper section of the tower would have been directly inside the fireball and blast environment. The floors nearest the detonation would have suffered catastrophic structural damage almost immediately, destroying critical columns, floor systems, and connections supporting everything above. Rather than producing a neat vertical collapse like controlled demolition, the damage would almost certainly have been uneven. The upper section would lose support asymmetrically, causing enormous sections of the tower to break apart and fall outward under gravity. The lower floors, suddenly carrying loads they were never designed to support, while already damaged from the blast, would then begin falling progressively into the streets and buildings below. So at least to me, the more believable angle to the 12,000 immediate deaths is not that the bomb incinerated them instantly, like the account states, but that the bomb was the trigger and the buildings became the weapon. And once you understand that the catastrophe was the result of a chain reaction, the next part of the official account becomes much harder to explain. It states that the nuke caused a minor earthquake that liquefied parts of the fill and flooded the inner city. And the fact is, the flooding and collapse of the city's infrastructure are both things that are entirely plausible. It's the explanation that's the problem. A detonation high in the building like Night City's was, transfers very little of its energy into the earth below. And this is a well-established consequence of how blast waves propagate. Because the explosion occurs in the air, most of its energy expands into the atmosphere rather than coupling it to the ground. By contrast, an underground detonation transfers its energy directly into the surrounding rock, making it vastly more efficient at generating seismic waves. For liquefaction to occur, you generally need strong and sustained ground shaking, usually from an earthquake around magnitude 5.0 or greater in susceptible soils. And the Night City explosion simply does not have the characteristics required to create that. The Cannon test in 1971 is probably the closest real-world comparison we have to show you what I mean. It was a 5 megaton nuclear weapon, roughly 10,000 times more powerful than the Night City bomb. And it was detonated nearly 1,800 meters underground, where nuclear energy is coupled into the surrounding rock far more efficiently. That explosion produced ground shaking equivalent to a roughly 7.0 magnitude earthquake. By comparison, the Night City bomb was not only vastly smaller, but almost none of its energy was efficiently transferred into the earth. Even if we made the extremely generous assumption that the full yield scaled directly with seismic energy, which it does not, a half-kiloton device still lacks anywhere near enough seismic energy to produce earthquake-like ground motion. Based on real-world nuclear effects, it's almost impossible an earthquake caused widespread liquefaction after the explosion in Night City. So where could the flooding have come from? The answer doesn't actually require an earthquake. Corpo Plaza sits immediately beside the waterfront on reclaimed coastal land with a naturally high water table. Now imagine a nuclear blast tearing through the center of the district. Even at only half a kiloton, the blast wave would still have produced extreme overpressure, capable of damaging surrounding buildings and placing enormous stress on the systems buried beneath the streets. Then, add the collapse of 2 megatowers, containing hundreds of thousands if not over 1 million tons of steel and concrete, slamming into the ground above an already damaged city, and that combination could realistically rupture water mains, drainage systems, and other underground utilities. Once that network fails, flooding becomes a cascading infrastructure problem rather than a geological one. And the reason that matters is that an earthquake and a collapsing skyscraper are not the same kind of problem. If the flooding came from the towers rather than a nuclear earthquake, the questions change completely. Why did they collapse that way? Could it have been prevented? How much of the death toll came from the buildings rather than the weapon? Those are uncomfortable questions for any corporation whose headquarters became the deadliest structure in history. And they're even more uncomfortable for a government that supplied the bomb, wrote off the city as a loss, and then spent the next 2 decades controlling the narrative of what happened. Because here's what the law actually tells us about who wrote the official report. Within hours of the disaster, President Kress, former Militech CEO, had already begun constructing what the law calls the big lie. Militech's bomb had caused the explosion, but the official story blamed Arasaka. Kress nationalized Militech and disseminated a version of events through every corporate PR machine available to her. The earthquake claim, the nuclear disaster framing, the idea that the destruction was an inevitable physical consequence of the weapon, all of it spread through media that the same powers controlled. It took over 20 years for an independent journalist named Trace Santiago to finally expose what actually happened. But by then, the physical details of the account, the earthquake, the liquefaction, and the incineration had been repeated for over 2 decades. They were never scrutinized, they were just the story everyone knew. And it turns out that the story everyone knew contains a physical mechanism that literally couldn't have happened. And look, I've only scratched the surface here. There are details about the day I haven't touched on, consequences I haven't measured, and claims I haven't tested. This isn't an exhaustive account of August 2023. It couldn't be. The law itself admits a complete account probably doesn't exist. But the things I did test, the incineration claim, the earthquake, both point in the same direction. That the official account doesn't describe a natural consequence of a nuclear weapon, but a convenient story that hid the truth for over 20 years.